Welcome to Nebula Narratives, your gateway to immersive science fiction audiobooks. If you love epic journeys, alien worlds, and thrilling futures, you're in the right place. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the adventure. And hey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories beyond the stars. Chapter 1: The Eve of the War by H.G. Wells. No one would have believed in the last years of the 19th century that this world was being watched keenly and closely by intelligences greater than man's, and yet as mortal as his own. That as men busied themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. With infinite complacency, men went to and fro over this globe about their little affairs, serene in their assurance of their empire over matter. It is possible that the infusoria under the microscope do the same. No one gave a thought to the older worlds of space as sources of human danger, or thought of them only to dismiss the idea of life upon them as impossible or improbable. It is curious to recall some of the mental habits of those departed days. At most, terrestrial men fancied there might be other men upon Mars, perhaps inferior to themselves and ready to welcome a missionary enterprise. Yet across the gulf of space, minds that are to our minds as ours are to those of the beasts that perish, intellects vast and cool and unsympathetic, regarded this earth with envious eyes, and slowly and surely drew their plans against us. And early in the 20th century came the great disillusionment. The planet Mars, I scarcely need remind the reader, revolves about the sun at a mean distance of 140,000 miles, and the light and heat it receives from the sun is barely half of that received by this world. It must be, if the nebula hypothesis has any truth, older than our world, and long before this earth ceased to be molten, life upon its surface must have begun its course. The fact that it is scarcely 1/7 of the volume of the Earth must have accelerated its cooling to the temperature at which life could begin. It has air and water and all that is necessary for the support of animated existence. Yet so vain is man, and so blinded by his vanity, that no writer, up to the very end of the 19th century, expressed any idea that intelligent life might have developed there far, or indeed at all, beyond its earthly level. Nor was it generally understood that since Mars is older than our Earth, with scarcely a quarter of the superficial area and remoter from the Sun, it necessarily follows that it is not only more distant from time's beginning, but nearer its end. The secular cooling that must someday overtake our planet has already gone far indeed with our neighbour. Its physical condition is still largely a mystery. But we know now that even in its equatorial region the midday temperature barely approaches that of our coldest winter. Its air is much more attenuated than ours. Its oceans have shrunk until they cover but a third of its surface, and as its slow seasons change, huge snowcaps gather and melt about either pole and periodically inundate its temperate zones. That last stage of exhaustion, which to us is still incredibly remote, has become a present-day problem for the inhabitants of Mars. The immediate pressure of necessity has brightened their intellects, enlarged their powers, and hardened their hearts. And looking across space with instruments and intelligences such as we have scarcely dreamed of, they see, at its nearest distance, only 35,000 of miles sunward of them, a morning star of hope, our own warmer planet, green with vegetation and grey with water, but with a cloudy atmosphere eloquent of fertility, with glimpses through its drifting cloud wisps of broad stretches of populous country and narrow, navy-crowded seas. And we men, the creatures who inhabit this earth, must be to them at least as alien and lowly as are the monkeys and lemurs to us. The intellectual side of man already admits that life is an incessant struggle for existence, and it would seem that this too is the belief of the minds upon Mars. Their world is far gone in its cooling, and this world is still crowded with life, but crowded only with what they regard as inferior animals. To carry warfare sunward is indeed their only escape from the destruction that, generation after generation, creeps upon them. And before we judge them too harshly, we must remember what ruthless and utter destruction our own species has wrought, not only upon animals such as the vanished bison and the dodo, but upon its inferior races. The Tasmanians, in spite of their human likeness, were entirely swept out of existence in a war of extermination waged by European immigrants in the space of 50 years. Are we such apostles of mercy as to complain if the Martians warred in the same spirit? The Martians seem to have calculated their descent with amazing subtlety. Their mathematical learning is evidently far in excess of ours, and to have carried out their preparations with a well-nigh perfect unanimity. Had our instruments permitted it, we might have seen the gathering trouble far back in the 19th century. Men like Schiaparelli watched the red planet. It is odd, by the by, that for countless centuries Mars has been the star of war, but failed to interpret the fluctuating appearances of the markings they mapped so well. All that time the Martians must have been getting ready. During the opposition of 1894, a great light was seen on the illuminated part of the disk, first at the Lick Observatory, then by Perrotin of Nice and other observers. English readers heard of it first in the issue of Nature, dated August 2nd. I am inclined to think that this blaze may have been the casting of the huge gun in the vast pit sunk into their planet, from which their shots were fired at us. Peculiar markings, as yet unexplained, were seen near the site of that outbreak during the next two oppositions. The storm burst upon us 6 years ago now. As Mars approached opposition, Lavelle of Java set the wires of the astronomical exchange palpitating with the amazing intelligence of a huge outbreak of incandescent gas upon the planet. It had occurred towards midnight of the 12th, and the spectroscope to which he had at once resorted indicated a mass of flaming gas, chiefly hydrogen, moving with an enormous velocity towards this Earth. This jet of fire had become invisible about 12:15. He compared it to a colossal puff of flame suddenly and violently squirted out of the planet, as flaming gas rushes out of a gun. And yet the next day there was nothing of this in the papers except a little note in the Daily Telegraph, and the world went in ignorance of one of the gravest dangers that ever threatened the human race. I might not have heard of the eruption at all had I not met Ogilvy, the well-known astronomer, at Ottershaw. He was immensely excited at the news, and in the excess of his feelings invited me up to take a turn with him that night in a scrutiny of the red planet. In spite of all that has happened since, I still remember that vigil very distinctly. The black and silent observatory, the shadowed lantern throwing a feeble glow upon the floor in the corner, the steady ticking of the clockwork of the telescope, the little slit in the roof, an oblong profundity with the stardust streaked across it. Ogilvy moved about, invisible but audible. Looking through the telescope, one saw a circle of deep blue and the little round planet swimming in the field. It seemed such a little thing, so bright and small and still, faintly marked with transverse stripes, and slightly flattened from the perfect round. But so little it was, so silvery warm, a pin's head of light. It was as if it quivered, but really this was the telescope vibrating with the activity of the clockwork that kept the planet in view. As I watched, the planet seemed to grow larger and smaller and to advance and recede, but that was simply that my eye was tired. 40 millions of miles it was from us, more than 40 millions of miles of void. Few people realize the immensity of vacancy in which the dust of the material universe swims. Near it in the field, I remember, were 3 faint points of light, 3 telescopic stars infinitely remote, and all around it was the unfathomable darkness of empty space. You know how that blackness looks on a frosty starlight night. In a telescope it seems far profounder, and invisible to me because it was so remote and small. Flying swiftly and steadily towards me across that incredible distance, drawing nearer every minute by so many thousands of miles, came the thing they were sending us, the thing that was to bring so much struggle and calamity and death to the earth. I never dreamed of it then as I watched. No one on Earth dreamed of that unerring missile. That night, too, another invisible missile started on its way to the Earth from Mars, just a second or so under 24 hours after the first one. I remember how I sat on the table there in the blackness, with patches of green and crimson swimming before my eyes. I wished I had a light to smoke by, little suspecting the meaning of the minute gleam I had seen, and all that it would presently bring me. Ogilvy watched till 1, and then gave it up, and we lit the lantern and walked over to his house. Down below in the darkness were Ottershaw and Chertsey and all their hundreds of people, sleeping in peace. Chapter 2, The Falling Star by H.G. Wells. Then came the night of the first falling star. It was seen early in the morning, rushing over Winchester eastward, a line of flame high in the atmosphere. Hundreds must have seen it and taken it for an ordinary falling star. Albin described it as leaving a greenish streak behind it that glowed for some seconds. Denning, our greatest authority on meteorites, stated that the height of its first appearance was about 90 or 100 miles. It seemed to him that it fell to Earth about 100 miles east of him. I was at home at that hour and writing in my study, and although my French windows faced towards Ottershaw and the blind was up, for I loved in those days to look up at the night sky, I saw nothing of it. Yet this strangest of all things that ever came to Earth from outer space must have fallen while I was sitting there, visible to me had I only looked up as it passed. Some of those who saw its flight say it travelled with a hissing sound. I myself heard nothing of that. Many people in Berkshire, Surrey and Middlesex must have seen the fall of it, and at most have thought that another meteorite had descended. No one seems to have troubled to look for the fallen mass that night. But very early in the morning, poor Ogilvy, who had seen the shooting star, and who was persuaded that a meteorite lay somewhere on the common between Horsell, Ottershaw and Woking, rose early with the idea of finding it. Find it he did, soon after dawn, and not far from the sand pits. An enormous hole had been made by the impact of the projectile, and the sand and gravel had been flung violently in every direction over the heath, forming heaps visible a mile and a half away. The heather was on fire eastward, and a thin blue smoke rose against the dawn. The thing itself lay almost entirely buried in sand. Amidst the scattered splinters of a fir tree, it had shivered to fragments in its descent. The uncovered part had the appearance of a huge cylinder, caked over and its outline softened by a thick, scaly, dun-coloured incrustation. It had a diameter of about 30 yards. He approached the mass, surprised at the size and more so at the shape, since most meteorites are rounded more or less completely. It was, however, still so hot from its flight through the air as to forbid his near approach. A stirring noise within its cylinder he ascribed to the unequal cooling of its surface, for at that time it had not occurred to him that it might be hollow. He remained standing at the edge of the pit that the thing had made for itself, staring at its strange appearance, astonished chiefly at its unusual shape and colour, and dimly perceiving even then some evidence of design in its arrival. The early morning was wonderfully still, and the sun, just clearing the pine trees towards Weybridge, was already warm. He did not remember hearing any birds that morning. There was certainly no breeze stirring, and the only sounds were the faint movements from within the cindery cylinder. He was all alone on the common. Then suddenly he noticed with a start that some of the grey clinker, the ashy incrustation that covered the meteorite, was falling off the circular edge of the end. It was dropping off in flakes and raining down upon the sand. A large piece suddenly came off and fell with a sharp noise that brought his heart into his mouth. For a minute he scarcely realized what this meant, and, although the heat was excessive, he clambered down into the pit close to the bulk to see the thing more clearly. He fancied even then that the cooling of the body might account for this, but what disturbed that idea was the fact that the ash was falling only from the end of the cylinder, and when he suddenly perceived that very slowly the circular top of the cylinder was rotating on its body, he remained dumbfounded. By the time he had grasped that the cylinder was artificial, with a screw or something of the kind, the lid was rotating outwards. He stepped back. It was only then, when he heard the sounds and saw the movements, that he realized a fearful truth. The cylinder was hollow, with an end that screwed out. Something within the cylinder was unscrewing the top. "Good heavens," said Ogilvy. "There's a man in it, men in it, half roasted to death, trying to escape." At once, with a quick mental leap, he linked the thing with the flash upon Mars. The thought of the confined creature was so dreadful to him that he forgot the heat and went forward again to the edge of the pit to help turn. But luckily the dull radiation arrested him before he could burn his hands on the still glowing metal. At that, he stood irresolute for a moment, then turned, scrambled out of the pit, and set off running wildly into Woking. The time then must have been somewhere about 6 o'clock. He met a wagoner and tried to make him understand, but the tale he told and his appearance were so wild, his hat had fallen off in the pit, that the man simply drove on. He was equally unsuccessful with the potman, who was just unlocking the doors of the public house by Horsell Bridge. The fellow thought he was a lunatic at large, and made an unsuccessful attempt to shut him into the tap-room. That sobered him a little, and when he saw Henderson, the London journalist, in his garden, he called over the palings and made himself understood. "Henderson," he called, "you saw that shooting star last night?" "Well," said Henderson, "it's out on Horsell Common now." "Good Lord," said Henderson. "Fallen meteorite, that's good. But it's something more than a meteorite. It's a cylinder, an artificial cylinder, man, and there's something inside." Henderson stood up with his spade in his hand. "What's that?" he said. He was deaf in one ear. Ogilvy told him all that he had seen. Henderson was a minute or so taking it in. Then he dropped his spade, snatched up his jacket, and came out into the road. The two men hurried back at once to the common and found the cylinder still lying in the same position. But now the sounds inside had ceased, and a thin circle of bright metal showed between the top and the body of the cylinder. Air was either entering or escaping at the rim with a thin, sizzling sound. They listened, rapped on the scaly burnt metal with a stick, and meeting with no response, they both concluded the man or men inside must be insensible or dead. Of course the two were quite unable to do anything. They shouted consolation and promises, and went off back to the town again to get help. One can imagine them, covered with sand, excited and disordered, running up the little street in the bright sunlight just as the shop folks were taking down their shutters and people were opening their bedroom windows. Henderson went into the railway station at once, in order to telegraph the news to London. The newspaper articles had prepared men's minds for the reception of the idea. By 8 o'clock, a number of boys and unemployed men had already started for the common to see the dead men from Mars. That was the form the story took. I heard of it first from my newspaper boy about 8:45, when I went out to get my Daily Chronicle. I was naturally startled, and lost no time in going out and across the Ottershaw Bridge to the sand pits. Chapter 3, on Horsell Common by H.G. Wells. I found a little crowd of perhaps 20 people surrounding the huge hole in which the cylinder lay. I have already described the appearance of that colossal bulk embedded in the ground. The turf and gravel about it seemed charred as if by a sudden explosion. No doubt its impact had caused a flash of fire. Henderson and Ogilvy were not there. I think they perceived that nothing was to be done for the present, and had gone away to breakfast at Henderson's house. There were 4 or 5 boys sitting on the edge of the pit, with their feet dangling and amusing themselves, until I stopped them by throwing stones at the giant mass. After I had spoken to them about it, they began playing at touch in and out of the group of bystanders. Among these were a couple of cyclists, a jobbing gardener I employed sometimes, a girl carrying a baby, Greg the butcher and his little boy, and 2 or 3 loafers and golf caddies who were accustomed to hang about the railway station. There was very little talking. Few of the common people in England had anything but the vaguest astronomical ideas in those days. Most of them were staring quietly at the big table-like end of the cylinder, which was still as Ogilvy and Henderson had left it. I fancy the popular expectation of a heap of charred corpses was disappointed at this inanimate bulk. Some went away while I was there, and other people came. I clambered into the pit and fancied I heard a faint movement under my feet. The top had certainly ceased to rotate. It was only when I got thus close to it that the strangeness of this object was at all evident to me. At the first glance it was really no more exciting than an overturned carriage or a tree blown across the road. Not so much so, indeed. It looked like a rusty gas float. It required a certain amount of scientific education to perceive that the grey scale of the thing was no common oxide. that the yellowish-white metal that gleamed in the crack between the lid and the cylinder had an unfamiliar hue. Extraterrestrial had no meaning for most of the onlookers. At that time, it was quite clear in my own mind that the thing had come from the planet Mars. But I judged it improbable that it contained any living creature. I thought the unscrewing might be automatic. In spite of Ogilvy, I still believed that there were men in Mars. My mind ran fancifully on the possibilities of its containing manuscripts, on the difficulties in translation that might arise, whether we should find coins and models in it, and so forth. Yet it was a little too large for assurance on this idea. I felt an impatience to see it opened. About 11, as nothing seemed happening, I walked back, full of such thought, to my home in Maybury, but I found it difficult to get to work upon my abstract investigations. In the afternoon, the appearance of the Common had altered very much. The early editions of the evening papers had startled London with enormous headlines: a message received from Mars, remarkable story from Woking, and so forth. In addition, Ogilvy's wire to the Astronomical Exchange had roused every observatory in the 3 kingdoms. There were half a dozen flies or more from the Woking station standing in the road by the sandpits, a basket chaise from Chobham, and a rather lordly carriage. Besides that, there was quite a heap of bicycles. In addition, a large number of people must have walked, in spite of the heat of the day, from Woking and Chertsey, so that there was altogether quite a considerable crowd, 1 or 2 gaily dressed ladies among the others. It was glaringly hot, not a cloud in the sky nor a breath of wind, and the only shadow was that of the few scattered pine trees. The burning heather had been extinguished, but the level ground towards Ottershaw was blackened as far as one could see, and still giving off vertical streamers of smoke. An enterprising sweetstuff dealer in the Chobham Road had sent up his son with a barrow-load of green apples and ginger beer. Going to the edge of the pit, I found it occupied by a group of about half a dozen men: Henderson, Ogilvy, and a tall, fair-haired man that I afterwards learned was Stent, the Astronomer Royal, with several workmen wielding spades and pickaxes. Stent was giving directions in a clear, high-pitched voice. He was standing on the cylinder, which was now evidently much cooler. His face was crimson and streaming with perspiration, and something seemed to have irritated him. A large portion of the cylinder had been uncovered, though its lower end was still embedded. As soon as Ogilvy saw me among the staring crowd on the edge of the pit, he called to me to come down, and asked me if I would mind going over to see Lord Hilton, the lord of the manor. The growing crowd, he said, was becoming a serious impediment to their excavations, especially the boys. They wanted a light railing put up, and help to keep the people back. He told me that a faint stirring was occasionally still audible within the case, but that the workmen had failed to unscrew the top, as it afforded no grip to them. The case appeared to be enormously thick, and it was possible that the faint sounds we heard represented a noisy tumult in the interior. I was very glad to do as he asked, and so become one of the privileged spectators within the contemplated enclosure. I failed to find Lord Hilton at his house, but I was told he was expected from London by the 6 o'clock train from Waterloo, and as it was then about 5:15, I went home, had some tea, and walked up to the station to waylay him. Chapter 4. The Cylinder Opens, by H.G. Wells. When I returned to the Common, the sun was setting. Scattered groups were hurrying from the direction of Woking, and 1 or 2 persons were returning. The crowd about the pit had increased, and stood out black against the lemon yellow of the sky, a couple of 100 people, perhaps. There were raised voices, and some sort of struggle appeared to be going on about the pit. Strange imaginings passed through my mind. As I drew nearer, I heard Stent's voice. "Keep back! Keep back!" A boy came running towards me. "It's moving," he said to me as he passed. "It's screwing and screwing out. I don't like it. I'm going home, I am." I went on to the crowd. There were really, I should think, 200 or 300 people elbowing and jostling one another, the 1 or 2 ladies there being by no means the least active. "He's fallen in the pit," cried someone. "Keep back," said several. The crowd swayed a little, and I elbowed my way through. Everyone seemed greatly excited. I heard a peculiar humming sound from the pit. "I say," said Ogilvy, "help keep these idiots back. We don't know what's in the confounded thing, you know." I saw a young man, a shop assistant in Woking, I believe he was, standing on the cylinder and trying to scramble out of the hole again. The crowd had pushed him in. The end of the cylinder was being screwed out from within. Nearly 2 feet of shining screw projected. Somebody blundered against me, and I narrowly missed being pitched onto the top of the screw. I turned, and as I did so the screw must have come out, for the lid of the cylinder fell upon the gravel with a ringing concussion. I stuck my elbow into the person behind me and turned my head towards the thing again. For a moment that circular cavity seemed perfectly black. I had the sunset in my eyes. I think everyone expected to see a man emerge, possibly something a little unlike us terrestrial men, but in all essentials a man. I know I did. But, looking, I presently saw something stirring within the shadow. Greyish, billowy movements, one above another, and then 2 luminous discs, like eyes. Then something resembling a little grey snake, about the thickness of a walking stick, coiled up out of the writhing middle and wriggled in the air towards me, and then another. A sudden chill came over me. There was a loud shriek from a woman behind. I half-turned, keeping my eyes fixed upon the cylinder still, from which other tentacles were now projecting, and began pushing my way back from the edge of the pit. I saw astonishment giving place to horror on the faces of the people about me. I heard inarticulate exclamations on all sides. There was a general movement backward. I saw the shopman struggling still on the edge of the pit. I found myself alone and saw the people on the other side of the pit running off, Stent among them. I looked again at the cylinder, and ungovernable terror gripped me. I stood petrified and staring. A big greyish rounded bulk, the size perhaps of a bear, was rising slowly and painfully out of the cylinder. As it bulged up and caught the light, it glistened like wet leather. 2 large dark-coloured eyes were regarding me steadfastly. The mass that framed them, the head of the thing, was rounded and had, one might say, a face. There was a mouth under the eyes, the lipless brim of which quivered and panted and dropped saliva. The whole creature heaved and pulsated convulsively. A lank tentacular appendage gripped the edge of the cylinder, another swayed in the air. Those who have never seen a living Martian can scarcely imagine the strange horror of its appearance. The peculiar V-shaped mouth with its pointed upper lip, the absence of brow ridges, the absence of a chin beneath the wedge-like lower lip, the incessant quivering of this mouth, the Gorgon groups of tentacles, the tumultuous breathing of the lungs in a strange atmosphere, the evident heaviness and painfulness of movement due to the greater gravitational energy of the Earth. Above all, the extraordinary intensity of the immense eyes were at once vital, intense, inhuman, crippled, and monstrous. There was something fungoid in the oily brown skin, something in the clumsy deliberation of the tedious movements unspeakably nasty. Even at this first encounter, this first glimpse, I was overcome with disgust and dread. Suddenly the monster vanished. It had toppled over the brim of the cylinder and fallen into the pit with a thud like the fall of a great mass of leather. I heard it give a peculiar thick cry, and forthwith another of these creatures appeared darkly in the deep shadow of the aperture. I turned and, running madly, made for the first group of trees, perhaps 100 yards away, but I ran slantingly and stumbling, for I could not avert my face from these things. There, among some young pine trees and furze bushes, I stopped, panting, and waited further developments. The common round the sand pits was dotted with people, standing like myself in a half-fascinated terror, staring at these creatures, or rather at the heaped gravel at the edge of the pit in which they lay. And then, with a renewed horror, I saw a round, black object bobbing up and down on the edge of the pit. It was the head of the shopman who had fallen in, but showing as a dark lump against the hot western sun. Now he got his shoulder and knee up, and again he seemed to slip back until only his head was visible. Suddenly he vanished, and I could have fancied a faint shriek had reached me. I had a momentary impulse to go back and help him that my fears overruled. Everything was then quite invisible, hidden by the deep pit and the heap of sand that the fall of the cylinder had made. Anyone coming along the road from Chobham or Woking would have been amazed at the sight. a dwindling multitude of perhaps 100 people or more, standing in a great irregular circle, in ditches, behind bushes, behind gates and hedges, saying little to one another, and that in short, excited shouts, and staring hard at a few heaps of sand. The barrow of ginger beer stood, a queer derelict, black against the burning sky, and in the sand pits was a row of deserted vehicles with their horses feeding out of nosebags or pawing the ground. Chapter 5. The Heat Ray by H.G. Wells. After the glimpse I had had of the Martians emerging from the cylinder in which they had come to the Earth from their planet, a kind of fascination paralyzed my actions. I remained standing knee-deep in the heather, staring at the mound that hid them. I was a battleground of fear and curiosity. I did not dare to go back towards the pit, but I felt a passionate longing to peer into it. I began walking, therefore, in a big curve, seeking some point of vantage and continually looking at the sand heaps that hid the newcomers to our Earth. Once a leash of thin black whips, like the arms of an octopus, flashed across the sunset and was immediately withdrawn, and afterwards a thin rod rose up, joint by joint, bearing at its apex a circular disc that spun with a wobbling motion. What could be going on there? Most of the spectators had gathered in one or two groups, one a little crowd towards Woking, the other a knot of people in the direction of Chobham. Evidently they shared my mental conflict. There were few near me. One man I approached. He was, I perceived, a neighbour of mine, though I did not know his name, and accosted. But it was scarcely a time for articulate conversation. "What ugly brutes," he said. "Good God, what ugly brutes!" He repeated this over and over again. "Did you see a man in the pit?" I said, but he made no answer to that. We became silent, and stood watching for a time side by side, deriving, I fancy, a certain comfort in one another's company. Then I shifted my position to a little knoll that gave me the advantage of a yard or more of elevation, and when I looked for him presently, he was walking towards Woking. The sunset faded to twilight before anything further happened. The crowd far away on the left towards Woking seemed to grow, and I heard now a faint murmur from it. The little knot of people towards Chobham dispersed. There was scarcely an intimation of movement from the pit. It was this, as much as anything, that gave people courage, and I suppose the new arrivals from Woking also helped to restore confidence. At any rate, as the dusk came on, a slow, intermittent movement upon the sand pits began, a movement that seemed to gather force as the stillness of the evening about the cylinder remained unbroken. Vertical black figures in twos and threes would advance, stop, watch, and advance again, spreading out as they did so in a thin, irregular crescent that promised to enclose the pit in its attenuated horns. I, too, slowly and fearfully, made my way towards the pit. I saw Ogilvy, the astronomer, evidently busy writing in his notebook and flashing a tiny electric lamp upon the cylinder. He was standing on the cylinder, and I heard him give a shout of astonishment. I do not know if it was because of that shout or what, but I instantly became aware of a change in motion of the crowd. A hesitation seemed to arrest everyone. A movement of black figures seemed to be going on in the pit, and then suddenly there was a flash of light, and a quantity of luminous greenish smoke came out of the pit in 3 distinct puffs, which drove up, one after the other, straight into the still air. This smoke, or flame, perhaps, would be the better word for it, was so bright that the deep blue sky overhead and the hazy stretches of brown common towards Chertsey, set with black pine trees, seemed to darken abruptly as these puffs arose, and to remain the darker after their dispersal. At the same time, a faint hissing sound became audible. Beyond the pit stood the little wedge of people with the white flag at its apex, arrested by these phenomena, a little knot of small vertical black shapes upon the black ground. As the green smoke arose, their faces flashed out pallid green and faded again as it vanished. Then slowly the hissing passed into a humming, into a long, loud, droning noise. Slowly a humped shape rose out of the pit, and the ghost of a beam of light seemed to flicker out from it. Forthwith flashes of actual flame, a bright glare leaping from one to another, sprang from the scattered group of men. It was as if some invisible jet impinged upon them and flashed into white flame. It was as if each man were suddenly and momentarily turned to fire. Then, by the light of their destruction, I saw them staggering and falling, and their supporters turning to run. I stood staring, not as yet realizing that this was death leaping from man to man in that little distant crowd. All I felt was that it was something very strange. An almost noiseless and blinding flash of light, and a man fell headlong and lay still, and as the heat ray, which it was, came to bear on the water cart, its contents simply flashed into steam. In a moment the cart was a ruin. The horse was one of the few victims on the common that night. The most of the animals had the sense to run early. The cart had smashed amid the tumult, and its driver lay fallen beside it. And then suddenly, with a gust of panic, that crowd of people in the distance seemed to sway and then break, and all come streaming back towards the common. I stood staring, amazed. I saw a man stumble and fall, and others fleeing from the scene. In a moment it was as if some invisible giant had lifted the dark night and slammed it down. The common was suddenly empty. The black figures vanished like mist, and unseen as yet, in the pit of the Martians, an invisible force of heat was moving swiftly and surely against us. This must have happened some time before the people near the pit understood what was happening. The crowd, returning from the direction of Woking, had grown and grown until it was a considerable size, and when it began to move, it moved slowly and hesitantly at first. Then, suddenly, the explosion of the heat ray sent everyone into blind terror. The heat ray was an invisible, scalding finger of destruction. It passed across the common in a flash, and everything it touched burst into flames or was instantly incinerated. Trees, heather, carts, tents, all vanished in a puff of white-hot smoke. Then came the stampede. Screaming and shouting, people ran for their lives, trampling over one another in their desperation. The heat ray swept through them, scattering bodies in its path. I turned and ran too, blinded with panic, not knowing if I should be the next to fall. And as I fled, the night was lit up with terrible flashes, and the ground shook with the terrible cries of the dying. Chapter 6. The Heat Ray in the Chobham Road by H.G. Wells. It is still a matter of wonder how the Martians are able to slay men so swiftly and so silently. Many think that as it is a heat ray, it makes its victims explode, or shrivel up, or fall into ashes. But the fact is that there is no explosion, no great noise, and often no visible sign of combustion. The intense heat seems to cause instant and complete destruction, leaving bodies charred or simply collapsed. About 6 o'clock, as I sat at tea with my wife in the drawing room overlooking the garden, a servant came in and told me that several people had gathered in the road outside. I went out and found a number of men talking excitedly together. One of them, it was the neighbour I had spoken to earlier, was telling them that he had seen a man burned to death, and that his clothes had not even caught fire. I did not believe him at the time, and I laughed. Soon, however, another came and brought a story corroborating the first. A heat ray from Mars had swept across the common. The crowd had fled. The Martians had risen from the cylinder and were attacking. I stood on the steps of my house and stared at the rising smoke that now rose above the trees of the common and drifted eastward. I felt suddenly very uneasy. The excitement of the morning had turned into dread. A few young men came running up the road. One of them carried a white flag. They were wild-eyed, and their mouths were dry with fear. They cried out that hundreds were dead, that the Martians were killing everyone. They had seen a man turned to fire, burned alive in a flash. Some were crying, some were shouting nonsense. Then a man on a bicycle came from the direction of Woking. He had a newspaper in his hand and waved it as he rode. "They're coming," he shouted. "The Martians are coming." Behind him more people began to arrive, running or walking quickly. A kind of panic had begun, although it was still local. The sense of something monstrous, something beyond all human experience, gripped us all. I went indoors, told my wife to pack a few things, and prepared the dog cart. I was determined to get her away from the area at once. The smoke from the common had grown darker, and a red glow pulsed beneath it. I could not see the Martians themselves from where I stood, but the stories all agreed. They had moved from the pit, and were using their terrible heat ray. As I drove out with my wife beside me, the road was becoming crowded. People were leaving Woking and Maybury in increasing numbers. Some carried bundles, some led children by the hand, and all were pale and silent. From time to time, we heard distant cries or saw a sudden glare in the sky. Once, we saw a red reflection on the walls of a house. The Martians were advancing slowly, methodically, as if studying us. They were not in a hurry. That fact alone chilled the blood. I stopped at the end of the road and asked a man what he had seen. He pointed towards Woking. The first of them, he said, came out of the pit about 5:30. They moved slowly, striding like great machines. They're not like anything you ever saw. One of them fired a beam of fire that cut across the trees like a scythe. I saw a man burst into flame without a sound. It's the devil come down, I tell you. Another man, more composed, explained that the Martians had not moved far, but that their weapons had incredible range. They sweep the common, he said. They don't chase people. They just wipe everything out where they stand. By this time, the road behind us was a steady stream of carts, bicycles, and people on foot. Many had come from as far as Chertsey or Leatherhead. Some believed the danger would soon pass. Others spoke of total destruction. We reached a fork in the road. I hesitated. Should we turn towards Leatherhead or go farther, towards London? My wife urged me to go to her cousins in Leatherhead, thinking it would be safer. I agreed. We passed several constables trying to keep order, but they could do little. The news was spreading faster than the facts. Rumours of Martians marching on London, of entire towns being destroyed, were already circulating. As we reached a hilltop, I stopped and turned to look back. The sky behind us was red and dark with smoke. Now and then a bright white light flickered deep within the haze, the flash of the heat ray. It was not yet full panic, but it was building. We were among the first of the refugees, but we would not be the last. The Martians had come, and nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 7. How I Reached Home, by H.G. Wells. For several days after leaving Leatherhead, I lived in such a state of confusion and stress that I can hardly recall the sequence of events. I remember running, stumbling, and pausing to catch my breath, but the details are like fragments of a fever dream. The dusk was gathering as I came through the town of Woking, and the streets were silent and deserted. The shops were closed, and the windows of most of the houses were shuttered. A sense of fear clung to every corner. As I made my way homeward, I passed several people hurrying in the opposite direction. They paid me no attention. Once or twice I was asked a question, but I was too exhausted to answer. My one thought was to reach my house and see if it still stood, if my wife was somehow there, though I knew she was not. My home was untouched. The gate was closed, and the ivy on the wall stirred gently in the evening breeze. For a moment I hesitated, listening. There was no sound, no sign of movement, not even from the birds. I entered and went through the silent rooms, calling my wife's name, though I knew she could not hear me. I found the house exactly as we had left it, everything in place, undisturbed. A table still laid for tea, a cushion fallen on the floor. In my study, I sat down and tried to think. The events of the day, the rising cylinder, the Martian's strange and hideous appearance, the heat ray, the flight of the people, the horror on the common, all ran through my mind in a confused torrent. I had seen death and destruction, but I had escaped, and now I was alone. I stayed there that night. I could not sleep. The silence of the town, the oppressive stillness that followed the chaos of the day, was worse than the noise of flight and panic. I found myself listening constantly, straining my ears for sounds, footsteps, voices, the noise of wheels. But there was nothing. Late in the night a sound reached me at last, the dull, metallic clang of something striking the ground far off. Then silence again. I went upstairs and looked out towards the common. The sky glowed faintly with a reddish hue, and now and then a flicker of white light would pulse through it. The Martians were still there, still working, still killing. The next morning I awoke after a short and restless sleep. My body ached, and I was weak with hunger. I had not eaten since noon the day before. I made myself some food and then went to the top of the hill behind my house to look out once more over the country. In the distance I saw a haze of smoke hanging over the land. Here and there the spires of churches or tall buildings stood like black fingers through the mist. The air was strangely still. I could see nothing moving, no people, no animals, not even birds. It was as though the world had stopped. Then, from the direction of Horsell Common, I saw a sudden flare, a long, sweeping line of fire. Trees vanished, and a portion of the common was turned to ash in an instant. The heat ray again. I returned to the house and packed a few things. I knew I could not stay there. The Martians would come eventually, and I would not wait for them. I decided to try to make my way to London, hoping to find my cousin, or at least learn what the government was doing. Before I left, I wrote a note and left it on the kitchen table, hoping against hope that my wife might somehow return and find it. The note read, "I have gone towards London. I am well. Do not be afraid, I will find you." Then I stepped out into the silent street, turned my face towards London and began to walk. Chapter 8, Friday Night by H.G. Wells. I first heard the Martians turning the cylinder when I was in the garden of my house. That was at about 10 o'clock. The faint puffs of green smoke still came from the pit. I watched the trees and bushes between me and the pit scrupulously, but there was nothing to be seen. The little group of black specks with the flag of white still hovered at the edge of the pit, and the feverish feeling of vague fear continued to rise. At midnight, the chimney of the house and the trees behind me were thrown against a luminous greenish sky, and I saw a third missile leave the cylinder. It was the third falling star, and it fell with a flash like lightning. It caused a silent vibratory shock. It was the same missile, the same strange green glare. I had seen the first in the afternoon when I had gone with Ogilvy, and now again this third dropped out of the night. Then I heard a voice, raised high in shrill excitement. I turned and ran down the lane towards my house. I had to pass the sand pits. The people there were all on the move. By the time I had reached the road, the crowd had become a stampede, and I was swept into the panic without a chance of escape. Everyone was shouting and screaming. I ran with the crowd, clambering over fences and pushing through hedges, trampling across gardens and through backyards. Some of the people were armed with sticks and farm tools. Others carried bundles of possessions. Some were shouting orders, others prayers. Some just screamed. We all moved with one instinct, to get away, to run from the terrible thing we did not understand. I remember stumbling across the railway cutting and down into a ditch where I lay for some minutes, gasping for breath. I could hear the noise of the crowd moving on. Far away to the south, I heard the hooting of a train. Then another explosion shook the ground. The second cylinder had fallen. When I was strong enough, I got up and continued walking through the night. I passed many others. Some walked in silence. Others argued or sobbed. There were children crying, and once I passed a woman singing to a baby with a strangely calm voice. The roads were becoming crowded, and the further I went, the more people I found. Everyone had heard something, some story of horror, some warning. 1,000 rumours passed from mouth to mouth. The Martians were marching on London. They had wiped out Woking. They had destroyed a regiment of soldiers. They were invincible. They were vulnerable to water. They had left already. No one knew the truth. As the night wore on, I found myself near a small inn. The landlord was trying to hold the doors closed while a crowd outside shouted for food and drink. I moved on, seeing nothing but confusion and fear. I walked all night and into the dawn. The roads were filled with people, horses, carts, bicycles, all headed away from the direction of Woking and towards London. Yet even as they fled, no one knew where safety lay. Towards morning, I came upon a group of people who had stopped to rest beside a field. I joined them for a while. An old man shared some bread with me. A young woman gave me water. No one spoke much. We were too tired, too afraid. Then, from the direction of Woking, came the low, steady hum of machinery, a sound unlike anything of Earth. A Martian machine was moving, and suddenly the fear returned, and we rose as one and fled again. Chapter 9. The Fighting Begins by H.G. Wells. Saturday lives in my memory as a day of suspense. It was a day of lassitude, too, hot and close, with, I am told, a rapidly fluctuating barometer. I had slept but little, though my wife had succeeded in sleeping, and I rose early. I went into my garden before breakfast and stood listening, but towards the common there was nothing stirring but a lark. The milkman came as usual. I heard the rattle of his chariot, and I went round to the side gate to ask the latest news. He told me that during the night the Martians had been surrounded by troops, and that guns were expected. Then, a familiar, reassuring note, I heard a train running towards Woking. "They aren't to be killed," said the milkman, "if that can possibly be avoided." I saw my neighbour gardening, chatted with him for a time, and then strolled into the village. I met a newspaper boy with a bundle of papers and bought one. It was rather overfull of descriptions of the common, and the only item of real interest to me was a statement that the Martians, as they were spelt, did not seem to have moved from their pit. That they may have had civilized intentions was suggested by a man who asserted he had seen a number of them busy in the pit. The majority of the people in the streets were bustling about their Saturday shopping, and others wandered to and fro. The soldiers were now distributed over the country and had spent the night under arms. A few scattered groups of soldiers lay on the common. In Woking Junction, the troops were still arriving, guards were posted at all the railway stations, and the traffic was partially suspended. I saw one train hurriedly discharged at the station, and the people made to run across the fields. Later, a mounted officer appeared at Maybury and began questioning us. I found myself back at home by midday. In the afternoon, I heard some of the guns being brought up, and about 5 o'clock I heard the sound of a violent collision. The sun was setting, and the sky was stained with dust and smoke when I went up to the roof of my house and looked across the rooftops and trees. I saw a long line of the Martian tripods, majestic and towering, standing against the setting sun. A great cloud of black smoke rose slowly over the trees and drifted in a great band to the south. The fire and smoke and the tall, silent figures of the Martians caused a strange contrast with the quiet evening sky. Then came a violent concussion and a rush of smoke. I heard the sound of something falling heavily. A second tripod reeled and fell with a crash. I shouted involuntarily. Then I saw something like a flash of lightning shoot from the Martians, and the hedge burst into flames. I turned away, stepped down, and went indoors, trembling. My wife was at the window. She had seen nothing. I made her sit down and tried to explain. My heart was pounding, and I could barely speak. That night we sat in the darkness. I packed a few things and made arrangements to leave as soon as possible, but I still hoped somehow the Martians would be defeated, that the guns would stop them, that someone somehow would save us. Chapter 10, In the Storm, by H.G. Wells. At about 8 o'clock, a noise of drumming and trumpets resounded from beyond the hill. People came out on the roads, drawn by a growing rumour. I stood at my gate, hesitating whether I should go and see what the matter was. I finally resolved to go to the station to learn more. As I turned the corner, I heard a voice cry out in a shrill scream, "They're coming!" And looking back, I saw the woman's face just before she vanished behind a hedge. The soldiers were coming through the village, dusty, disordered, and utterly unlike the smart troops I had seen earlier in the day. They were limping. Their faces were white and drawn, and their eyes wide with terror. One of them, bleeding from a gash on his forehead, staggered against a wall and slid to the ground. I tried to stop one of them to ask what had happened, but he pushed past me, panting. "Run," he said. "Just run." Another group followed, and then a mounted officer, his horse lathered and wild-eyed, reined in near me. He gestured frantically. "Get out! Get out while you can! They're coming down the hill!" I turned and ran back home, shouting for my wife. She met me at the door, her face pale. "What is it?" she asked. "No time," I said. "We must go. Now." We had only moments. I grabbed the small bag I had packed earlier. She snatched up her cloak. We ran into the garden, then out through the back gate to the field path beyond. From the hill behind us came a sudden crashing noise, trees splintering, the earth shaking beneath us. A deep, resonant boom echoed across the fields. I turned and saw, against the twilight sky, a great mechanical tripod striding into view. Its metal limbs gleamed dully in the fading light. Steam hissed from it as it advanced, a slow and terrible inevitability in its movement. The Martian heat ray lanced downward, striking a barn on the edge of the village. There was a sudden flash, and the structure disappeared in a blinding glare. Flames erupted, smoke billowed upward, and the air grew hot and choking. We ran. Across the fields, through hedges, stumbling over roots and stones. The sky behind us was now bright with the fire. Screams and cries carried on the wind. The Martians had reached Maybury. We reached a small wood and collapsed beneath the trees, gasping. Around us, other refugees huddled, men, women, and children, all dazed, all silent. A priest knelt nearby, murmuring prayers. A farmer clutched a bleeding hand. A young girl sobbed into her mother's lap. No one knew where to go. No one knew if anywhere was safe. Above the treetops, we could see the glow of the burning town. The Martians did not pursue immediately. Perhaps they were content to destroy what lay before them. A thunderstorm began to build. Lightning flickered on the horizon. The thunder rolled and mingled with the distant mechanical sounds of the Martians' advance. Rain began to fall, at first lightly, then with increasing fury. It hissed on the burning fields and rooftops, sending up clouds of steam. The storm, strangely, gave us cover. Under its veil we moved again, through the trees, over muddy tracks towards Leatherhead. My wife was exhausted, but she pressed on. We reached a ruined farmhouse and took shelter in the cellar. There, with others, we waited through the storm. The thunder masked the sounds of distant machines, and for a few hours the terror seemed held at bay. But even as the rain fell and the wind howled, I knew this was only the beginning. The Martians were not done. And tomorrow they would march again. Chapter 11. At the Window, by H.G. Wells. I have already said that my storms of emotion have a trick of exhausting themselves. After a time, I discovered that I was cold and wet, and with little pools of water about me on the stair carpet. I got up almost mechanically, went into the dining room and drank some whiskey, and then I was moved to change my clothes. After I had done that, I went upstairs to my study, but why I did so I do not know. The window of my study looks over the trees and the railway towards Horsell Common. In the hurry of our departure, this window had been left open. The sash had smashed, and the glass lay broken on the floor. The casement swung creaking in the wind. I stopped the scullery window, and by instinct I went upstairs to my study. A strange thing was this. My desk, the books, the papers, were just as I had left them. I could see all that as I stood by the door. But instead of going in, I felt compelled to look at the window. There I stood for a minute perhaps, then I went forward to the window. The view from the study was perfectly familiar. Across the common I could see the pine woods. I could make out the burning of the pine woods about the sandpits. The smoke was faint in the dusk. It trailed in threads across the sky, a red glare shading off into the blue of the evening. It was now about 7 o'clock. The patch of sunset sky had long since faded out, and the west was now a dark grey blue. The trees about the common were black against the brightness. Above them, over the smouldering remains of the second cylinder, one of the Martian fighting machines loomed up, huge and threatening. The thing was perfectly still. It stood almost exactly as I had seen it first, only now it was the centre of a strange, busy circle. Around it moved what seemed to be a number of people, perhaps Martians themselves, but I could not make them out. I stared and stared, hoping to see more, but there was only the great shape outlined against the fading sky. It was a thing altogether outside experience, and at the same time full of dread. I felt no impulse to flee, no fear. Only a vague wonder and a sense of powerlessness came over me. Then I saw something flicker within the shape, something like a red glow, glowing now and again through the metal. The tripod had stirred. The whole thing moved, turned slightly, and began to stride slowly across the common. Even then I did not move. I simply stood there, staring, dazed. I could hear now a dull, confused sound, like the clanking of iron and the thudding of giant feet. The machine passed out of my sight behind a copse of pine trees. I went down to the lower floor and sat down again in the dining room. I was trembling violently. My teeth rattled, my limbs ached. A feverish chill took hold of me. My heart beat like a hammer. For a long time I sat there motionless. Then I got up again and went to the window. The common was hidden in darkness now. The fire had sunk. Only a few fitful tongues of flame shot up from the blackness. Here and there a red ember glowed. I could hear the Martians now, 2 of them, striding away together. The sound was like the muffled thud of engines, and every now and then a measured, rhythmical beat. The darkness deepened. The stars came out, and the cold crept in upon me. I closed the window, fastened the door, and went to bed, though I felt I should never sleep again. And all through the night I heard the Martians moving, now near, now far, heavy, measured steps, a strange mechanical humming, and sometimes the hiss of the heat ray in the distance. It was the strangest vigil of my life. Chapter 12. What I Saw of the Destruction of Weybridge and Shepperton by H.G. Wells. As the dawn grew brighter, I ventured out again. My desire to know more of what was happening overcame my sense of personal danger. I crept down from the bedroom, where I had lain in the darkness and silence through the night, and went into the garden. There was still a thin mist, though the sky was clear. I found myself trembling as I looked over the hedge toward the common. The heat ray had withered everything. The hedges, the trees, even the green of the grass, had faded into a scorched, lifeless grey. I walked through this bleak landscape with a kind of awe. The house itself was untouched, but beyond it the trail of ruin stretched as far as I could see. I made my way towards Weybridge. I wanted to know what was being done. Surely, I thought, surely by now the government must be acting. Soldiers, artillery, something to fight these monsters. As I passed through the countryside, I saw other refugees, men and women with children, old men hobbling along with sticks, all looking for safety. All with the same expression: disbelief, confusion, fear. A few had bundles or carts, but many had nothing but the clothes they wore. I reached the river at Weybridge just as the sun was rising. There I found soldiers, real soldiers this time, not the dishevelled, terrified men I had seen the night before. They had set up guns along the riverbank and were preparing for a defence. The townspeople were evacuating. Boats were being loaded with supplies and people and ferried across the Thames. Steamers were being prepared. The roads were choked with wagons and crowds. I spoke with a soldier who told me the Martians were advancing towards Shepperton. He gestured to a point just beyond the hills. "They've crossed the common," he said. "They'll be here in an hour." We watched the hills, and then they appeared. 3 of them striding over the ridge. Gigantic machines gleaming in the sunlight, moving with incredible swiftness. The ground trembled with each step. There was a moment of silence. Then the guns opened fire. The roar of artillery shook the air. Shells burst around the Martians in clouds of smoke and dust. One of the tripods staggered slightly, and I hoped it had been hit. But then came the heat ray. A blinding flash, and the gun emplacement beside me vanished. Soldiers were thrown into the air like rag dolls. The earth shook as the weapon swept across the riverbank. Panic erupted. Men screamed. Some fled into the water. Others fired wildly, their bullets pinging off the tripod's armour with no effect. I ducked behind a ruined wall. From there I saw one of the machines reach the river. It paused, and then, with shocking grace, waded in. The water reached halfway up its legs, but it moved steadily across. One of the gunboats on the river opened fire. I watched as a shell struck one of the tripods square in the hood. The head exploded in a puff of black smoke. The machine reeled and collapsed with a thunderous crash into the water. The soldiers cheered. But the other 2 Martians turned their heat rays on the gunboat. It erupted into flames and sank in seconds. The battle was lost. I fled along the riverbank, through the trees and hedges, deafened by the noise of destruction. Behind me, the town of Weybridge was in flames. The air stank of burning wood and scorched metal. Eventually, I found myself alone again. The thunder of the tripods faded into the distance. I collapsed in a ditch, shaking. We had destroyed one of them, but they had destroyed a town, and more would come. Chapter 13. How I Fell In With the Curate by H.G. Wells. After getting this sudden lesson in the power of terrestrial weapons, the Martians retreated to their original position upon Horsell Common, and in their haste and the confusion of the dust, many people fled who had intended to return to their homes that night. The Martians did not show any disposition to pursue us at that time. They had not as yet learned the power of human weapons or the weakness of human beings. I stayed away from the common all that day and night, and, wandering in a westerly direction, found myself in a small town, where I was given shelter for the night. The next day I continued to wander through the countryside, driven by a mixture of fear, curiosity, and uncertainty. It was during this time that I fell in with a curate, a man evidently of gentle birth and education, but who was completely unhinged by the terrible events we were witnessing. I came upon him sitting by the roadside, weeping and praying, his face dirty and his clothes torn. He clutched a Bible in his hand and was speaking aloud to himself, though there was no one else about. When he saw me, he clung to me like a drowning man. "The Lord is mighty," he cried. "He will smite the sinners and deliver the faithful." I tried to calm him and offered him some of the food I had with me. He accepted it eagerly, and we sat together under the hedgerow and shared what little provisions we had. Though he was clearly shaken, he was not violent or mad in the dangerous sense. Rather, he was like a child, helpless and overwhelmed. Together we set out on foot once more. The curate talked incessantly, quoting scripture and lamenting the destruction he had seen. I listened to him with half an ear, my mind preoccupied with thoughts of my wife and the condition of London. I did not know whether she had reached Leatherhead or whether the Martians had gone in that direction. The roads were crowded with refugees, families on foot, in carts, on bicycles, all moving away from the direction of the Martians. Some were calm, others wild-eyed and frantic. Occasionally we passed soldiers trying to keep order or direct the flow of people, but they were few and far between. At one point, we stopped at a ruined village and found a well. While the curate drank deeply, I spoke with a group of men who had come from London. They told me that martial law had been declared, that the city was preparing for siege, and that new cylinders had fallen across the countryside. The invasion was far from over. The curate, who had been silent during this conversation, suddenly stood up and shouted, "The day of judgment is upon us. Repent." The men laughed and walked away, but I could see the fear in their eyes. None of us truly understood what was happening. We only knew that the old world had ended. That night the curate and I slept in a ruined farmhouse. Through the broken windows I could see the stars shining above. The night was quiet, but in the distance I thought I heard the faint metallic thud of a Martian machine. The curate prayed for deliverance. I lay awake, thinking of my wife and the city, and wondering what the morning would bring. Chapter 14, In London, by H.G. Wells. My younger brother was in London when the Martians fell at Woking. He was a medical student, working for an imminent examination, and he heard nothing of the arrival until Saturday morning. The morning papers on Saturday contained, in addition to lengthy special articles on the planet Mars, on life in the planets, and so forth, a brief and vaguely worded telegram, all the more striking for its brevity. The Martians, alarmed by the approach of a crowd, had killed a number of people with a quick-firing gun, so the story ran. The telegram concluded with the words, "Formidable as they seem to be, the Martians have not moved from the pit into which they have fallen, and indeed seem incapable of doing so. Probably this is due to the relative strength of the Earth's gravitational energy." On that last text, their leader-writer expanded very comfortingly. The other news was of the usual kind. It was a very uninteresting Saturday morning. My brother was reading this in a breakfast room at the top of a house in the upper part of Kensington. He was deep in his studies, but as the growing excitement around London became more evident, he became curious and ventured out. As he walked towards the city, he observed the increasing unrest of the population. The newsboys were shouting hoarse headlines, "Martians dead," "Martians defeated," "Heavy fighting at Woking," and people stopped in the streets to read the placards and discuss the uncertain information. That afternoon, papers announced that the government had authorized the destruction of the Martians, and a confident tone prevailed in editorials and public conversations. People believed the invasion would soon be over. But as night fell, the tone changed. News came that more cylinders had fallen, that entire towns had been wiped out. Survivors from the southwest spoke of terrifying machines, of burning fields, of armies scattered like leaves. Panic took root. The Sunday morning papers were a shock. They described the swift and complete rout of the British forces. There were descriptions of the Martians, taller than houses, walking on immense legs, using a weapon that set everything it touched on fire. Houses melted, people vanished in a puff of smoke. The death toll was beyond comprehension. By noon on Sunday, the streets of London were packed. Trains leaving the city were full. Cabs and carriages were overloaded. People were walking with their possessions on their backs. Some laughed and sang, treating it like a holiday. Others wept openly, All had the same instinct: escape. My brother joined the flow. He had a bicycle and decided to ride east, aiming for Chelmsford. The roads were crowded, the way difficult, but he pressed on. At Barnet, he encountered a scene of utter confusion. A mob surged around a horse cart, arguing and fighting. He pushed through and came upon 2 women, a lady and her servant, beset by rough men. Without hesitation, he intervened, threatening the assailants with a small revolver he carried. The men retreated, and the women, grateful, agreed to travel with him. The 3 continued together, making their way through the countryside, avoiding roads when possible, hiding in woods and sleeping rough. The lady's name was Miss Elphinstone. Her sister was in Leatherhead, where the first cylinder had fallen. The brother told them what he had heard. The Martians were not invincible, but nothing seemed to stop them. The army had failed. The heat ray was unstoppable. The black smoke they released choked everything in its path, and more cylinders were coming. The Martians were building something, a new kind of weapon, perhaps. They passed through Edgware and saw the aftermath of an attack. Houses burned, bodies lay in the streets. The Martians had moved on. The air was still heavy with smoke. By nightfall, they reached a village where they found a family willing to shelter them. They rested, but sleep was troubled. The distant sound of thunder, or was it the Martians' machines, echoed across the hills. London was falling. The Martians were advancing on all fronts, and still people fled. Chapter 15. What had happened in Surrey. It was while the curate had sat and talked so wildly to me, under the hedge in the flat meadows near Halliford, and while my brother was watching the fugitives stream over Westminster Bridge, that the Martians had resumed the offensive. So far as one can ascertain from the conflicting accounts that have been put forth, the majority of them remained busied with preparations in the pit until 9 that night, hurrying on some operation that disengaged huge volumes of green smoke. But 3 certainly came out about 8 o'clock, and advancing slowly and cautiously, made their way through Byfleet and Parford towards Ripley and Weybridge, and so came in sight of the expectant batteries against the setting sun. These Martians did not advance in a body, but in a line, each perhaps 1.5 miles from his nearest fellow. They communicated with each other by means of siren-like howls, running up and down the scale from one note to another. It was this howling and firing of the guns at Ripley and St. George's Hill that we heard at Upper Halliford. The Ripley gunners, unseasoned artillery volunteers, who ought never to have been placed in such a position, fired one wild, premature, ineffectual volley, and bolted on horse and foot through the deserted village, and the Martian walked serenely over their guns, stepped gingerly among them, passed in front of them, and so came unexpectedly upon the guns in Painshill Park, which he destroyed. The St. George's Hill men, however, were better led, or of a better mettle. Hidden by a pine wood as they were, they seemed to have been quite unsuspected by the Martian nearest to them. They laid their guns as deliberately as if they had been on parade, and fired at about 1,000 yards range. The shells flashed all round him, and he was seen to advance a few paces, stagger, and go down. Everybody yelled together, and the guns were reloaded in frantic haste. The overthrown Martian set up a prolonged ululation, and immediately a second rose above the pine trees to the east and came down to the help of his comrade. He approached, going now at a walking pace, and with a curious wriggling movement. Then he stopped, and the camera that was on his arm began to rotate. So soon as the camera was in position, he discharged the heat ray at the pine trees which hid the guns. A canard of heat ray swept across the pine trees, tore them up and rolled them over. The guns were suddenly uncovered, and the people who were still in hiding rushed out in panic. One fell headlong. The Martian appeared to be examining the turret on his fallen comrade, and then his attention was attracted by the pine wood. It was swept clean of retreating men. Then he turned back to his fallen comrade. The other Martians were now moving toward him, and the artillerymen who had escaped from Ripley were coming up from the east. The Martians had evidently been taken by surprise by the artillery fire and found it far more effective than they had expected. They were in consequence busy with preparations for retaliation, and after the exertions they had already made, they did not care to press their attack that night. As the night fell, the Martians withdrew to their original position in the sand pits. The night of the second engagement was notable for the attempt made by the authorities to gain the upper hand. The field telegraph and the heliograph were in constant use, and messages were sent to and fro between London and the front. The field telegraph was in use in the early morning, and messages came from all quarters. There was great hope and confidence. The Martians had been repulsed and had retired to the sand pits. They were surrounded on every side, and at daybreak fresh batteries were to open upon them. Fresh companies of soldiers came into Chertsey and Weybridge, and through the night men walked continually from Windsor, Egham, and Richmond, carrying their rifles and ammunition through the moonlight. Every motor car in London was in requisition, and every horse that could carry a man was employed. Every officer, almost without exception, was awake and busy through the night. The whole vast area of the southwestern suburbs was an armed camp. Every man in the southwestern counties capable of carrying arms had been called out and was on his way to the scene of action. Thus the second engagement ended in a rout. The Martians, hemmed in their pit and feeling the full force of the military power of England, had been checked, and it was confidently believed that they would be destroyed in the morning. That night the stream of fugitives continued to pour through London, but the panic had abated. The poor still clamoured to be led out of London, but no longer in terror. There was even a little jollity. The troops were everywhere, the government was clearly in control again, and the people were already beginning to return to their homes. Early in the morning the gallant artillerymen advanced from their position among the pine trees. They were jubilant and eager to complete the victory. As they drew near the sandpit, the ground trembled beneath their feet. Suddenly the foremost fell, and the line halted. A second later a dozen fell, and the rest, wild with horror, turned and fled. A tall Martian emerged from the pit, and a second and a third, striding over the trees and the bodies and the fallen guns, and stepped into the river. They waded deep into the water, making for the new camp of the artillery. This was the last attack made by the British Army upon the Martians. It was a most singular encounter. There was, after that, no further resistance. All the night and all the next day and all the next night, the Martians were working. The towering tripod lifted a second machine out of the pit. Slowly it was raised, and as it went higher and higher, it looked as though it were being drawn out of a pit of liquid. Some of the watchers ventured near enough to see the thing being lifted out, still wet from its subterranean hiding place, and came running back with horror-stricken faces. The thing came out head first, then the tentacles, then the bulk of the body. It rose like a new and mighty moon out of the pit. It was still dripping as it moved slowly forward. By the afternoon of the next day, all the Martians were again in motion. They were now all outside the pit, and they had formed in a crescent, 3 in front and 4 behind. The crowd in the distance watched them, and at first they were content to let them go, to watch the great tripods pass, striding steadily onward, glittering in the sun. But presently the guns began to speak. One by one the Martians turned, the fighting machines scattered like driftwood turned by a sudden tide. The crowd, made brave by success, cheered, thinking the Martians were retreating, and then, just then, the black smoke came. The black smoke came. It poured out in a great cloud from the tripods, and wherever it touched, men died. The fields were blackened and silent. The guns ceased to fire. The Martians towered high, peering over the smoke, and then, as the breeze spread it far and wide, they walked slowly forward through the silent, darkened fields, and the people of the earth fled before them once more. Chapter 16. The Exodus from London. So you understand the roaring wave of fear that swept through the greatest city in the world just as Monday was dawning, the stream of flight rising swiftly to a torrent, lashing in a foaming tumult round the railway stations, banked up into a horrible struggle about the shipping in the Thames, and hurrying by every available channel northward and eastward. By 10 o'clock, the police organisation, and by midday even the railway organisations, were losing coherency, losing shape and efficiency, guttering, softening, running at last in that swift liquefaction of the social body. All the railway lines north of the Thames and the southeastern people at Cannon Street had been warned by midnight on Sunday, and trains were being filled. People were fighting savagely for standing room in the carriages even at 2 o'clock. By 3, people were being trampled and crushed even in Bishopsgate Street, a couple of 100 yards or more from Liverpool Street Station. Revolvers were fired and men stabbed, and the policemen who had been sent to direct the traffic, exhausted and infuriated, were breaking the heads of the people they were called out to protect. And as the stillness of the dawn deepened, the violence of the day grew. Panic, horror, and social disintegration spread. Some of the fugitives from West Surrey were conversant with the black smoke, and they described its effects to the people in London, and this intelligence spread among the waiting crowds, a murmur of black smoke that affected the people as a gust of wind affects a pile of embers. There was a sudden stir amid the people, a movement of pressing back and forward, a boiling up, as it were, of the human mass, and for a moment or so no man was visible save for the swaying hats and heads. Suddenly a man emerged head and shoulders above the crowd, and then a girl's head appeared with a last star of terror on her face. Then came a steady stream of people climbing over the iron railings or escaping through windows into the yards of private houses. It was a stampede gigantic and terrible, without order and without a goal. 6 million people, unarmed and unprovisioned, driving headlong. It was the beginning of the rout of civilization, of the massacre of mankind. Directly below him the balloonist sees a network of streets, black with people, and then, rising out of the midst of them as though it were a tower of flame, nothing but a column of black vapour that sways and tosses and extends and contracts in the wind. It comes nearer, it covers one corner of the town, and in a little while he sees the people dropping in swathes like under a scythe. He sees the work of the heat ray along the river, cutting down people like corn, a purple streak along the streets, a line of fire and death. Then the cloud of smoke and the heat ray meet, and the whole lower portions of London disappear. It was as if some dreadful sorcerer had called up the spirit of death in the likeness of these monsters, and they moved about killing everything. Now this was the situation. The Martians were coming. The city of London was under siege. For 3 days people had fought for places on trains or ships. Men had been killed in the crush, and women had fainted. And still more trains were arriving at the station, more steamers were loading at the docks, and the police were beaten back, overwhelmed. The Martians were expected any hour. In the suburbs there were riots. Londoners, cut off from escape, vented their rage on the houses and shops of their neighbours. There was looting and violence. Shops were broken open and pillaged. Public buildings were sacked. Everywhere there was smoke. Fires began to spring up. The sky was reddened at night with the glow of flames. People were streaming across the country in carts, on bicycles, and on foot. Women carried babies. Old men tottered along behind. Horses fell and were cut loose, their loads abandoned. The roads were blocked with masses of people and of abandoned property. Fields were full of campfires, with groups huddled round them, and from all sides, wherever there was a ridge or tower, people watched for the Martians, hoping they would pass them by. All day Monday, and all through the night, the flight continued. The Martians did not come. They were working at something in the pit they had made near Woking, something which involved explosions and the emission of vast clouds of green smoke. But that delay only served to intensify the horror of the people. By Tuesday morning, things were at their worst. The houses were empty. The shops were shuttered and silent. Roads were strewn with abandoned possessions. Only the poor remained. Some too poor to escape. Some who would not leave their homes, and those who were mad or desperate. Among them stalked the looters, the drunks, and the dying. And still the Martians did not come. But about 2 in the afternoon a Martian was seen above the houses to the west. Then another and another, striding silently and swiftly toward London, glittering in the sun and making faint booming noises with their feet. A solitary policeman, armed only with a truncheon, saw them from Notting Hill and stood, paralysed by fear. Suddenly the Martians began to spray black smoke. It came in a slow, creeping cloud that rolled across the fields and streets like ink spreading through water. Birds dropped dead, leaves turned black. Men and women ran, fell, and died. Then came the heat ray, sweeping down the streets, igniting trees, melting iron, breaking glass with its fierce heat. The black smoke drifted onward, deeper into the city. The Martians behind it followed unhurriedly, as if sure of their prey. By nightfall, London was a city of death. Only scattered groups of people remained, hidden in cellars, underground stations, or behind closed shutters. Fires burned unchecked. The Thames ran dark and sluggish, its surface greasy with the ashes of buildings and bodies. And the Martians? They moved slowly, silently, relentlessly, as if they had all the time in the world. Chapter 17. The Thunder Child. Had the Martians only used their heat ray, the destruction they might have wrought would have been even more terrible than it was. They used it only when they were closely pursued, or to clear the way before them, and we cannot guess whether they had other means of destruction, or whether they relied entirely upon this weapon of strange and deadly power. But it is certain that the heat ray was the chief weapon, and that it gave them the advantage over the scattered and uncoordinated forces of humanity. For days after the flight from London, the Martians made no attempt to extend the range of their operations. They contented themselves with the southwestern district. They seemed to be preparing for further action. They were busy in their pit, and the only evidence of their presence was the occasional appearance of a tripod or the rising of a cloud of smoke from the pit. But one effort was made to stop them, and this effort deserves to be remembered, for it was a gallant thing. It was an ironclad vessel, the Thunder Child, which steamed out from the Thames and engaged the Martians near the mouth of the river. My brother, who had escaped from London by boat with 2 women he had rescued, was a witness to the scene. They were on a small steamer packed with fugitives, making their way down the Thames toward the sea. The boat was heavily laden, the engine weak, and progress was slow. The people were crowded together, anxious, silent, listening to the distant sounds of explosions and gunfire that echoed from the land. Some were praying, others staring toward the smoke that drifted above the countryside. Suddenly, there came a cry from the deck. One of the tripods had been seen moving along the coast, high above the trees and houses, striding toward the estuary. A moment later, another appeared. Then a third. Panic broke out among the passengers. Women screamed, men shouted, some tried to leap overboard. The captain shouted orders and the crew fought to keep control. But then, from the open sea, came a new sound, a deep, rhythmic pounding, like a giant heartbeat. It was the sound of the Thunder Child's engines. The ironclad came into view, black against the sky, smoke pouring from her funnels, the water foaming about her bows. The Martians saw her and hesitated. One turned its camera-like arm toward her. A jet of fire leaped from it, and the sea hissed and boiled. But the Thunder Child was not stopped. Her guns spoke. A shell burst in mid-air. Another struck the leg of the nearest tripod and exploded. The Martian staggered. The heat ray struck again. The air around the ironclad shimmered with heat. Paint bubbled and metal plates twisted. But the Thunder Child came on. Her forward gun fired again. The shell struck the body of the second tripod, and the great machine reeled and collapsed with a thunderous crash. A great cheer rose from the passengers of the steamer. The Martians turned to retreat, but the Thunder Child did not let them go. She pressed on, her bow rising and falling with the waves, her guns thundering. Another heat ray struck her, and flames leapt from her deck. Still she came on. The third tripod turned to flee, but it was too late. With a final burst of speed, the ironclad rammed it full force. The tripod rocked, teetered, and fell into the sea. The ironclad passed through the wreckage and vanished in smoke and steam. A moment later came a great explosion. The Thunder Child had been hit. She sank with all hands. But her sacrifice was not in vain. The Martians, shaken by the encounter, retreated inland. The steamer and the other vessels in the estuary escaped to the open sea. And so, for a time, the Martians were checked. My brother and his companions watched the battle in awe. The destruction of the tripods had seemed impossible, but now they had seen it with their own eyes. A new hope stirred in their hearts. They sailed on through the night, past the darkened coastline and the flickering glow of fires. Behind them, England burned. Ahead, the sea stretched wide and empty. But they had escaped, and for the first time in many days, the stars above seemed to shine with something like promise. Chapter 18. The Days of Imprisonment. The curate was lethargic, unreasonable. The remnants of his meal still lay where he had left them. He had slept, and now he sat staring at nothing, his face drawn and weak. As the days wore on, his manner became more and more unbearable. He talked incessantly of his fancied grievances. He had a strong sense of his own importance, and that he had been wickedly treated. He drank more than he ate, and I began to fear that he might die of sheer neglect. I cannot describe the horror of my soul at this idea. I had never before been made aware of the solemnity of life and the responsibility of a soul. But even though I felt all this, I kept my thoughts to myself and waited for the end. I still believed that, if the worst came to the worst, I had strength enough to crawl out at night and get food for myself. I had heard the Martians whooping to one another, and I had watched their doings from the slit in the wall. But it was not until the 5th day of our imprisonment that I ventured out again. I had gone into the scullery, but I returned speedily. A loud cry rang through the silent house, and I came back to find the curate on his feet, gesticulating and shouting. He was acting like a madman. I whispered to him to be silent, but he cried out that he had been starved and had been kept in a dungeon, and that he would not endure it. I laid my hands on him and tried to quiet him, but he flung me off and began to shout again. I had no choice. I struck him. I knocked him down, and then, terrified at what I had done, I dragged him into the scullery and shut the door. I could hear the Martians outside. The curate lay still for a while. Then he began to moan and weep. I turned my back on him and lay down again in the darkness. That night the Martians came. I heard them fumbling at the door and dragging something heavy across the floor. I dared not move. I lay trembling, listening. Presently the curate ceased his moaning and was silent. Then I heard a soft, slithering noise, like the sound of something brushing against the floor. I do not know how long I lay there. I was sick with fear, unable to sleep. At last I dozed off. When I awoke, the curate was gone. For 2 days I lay alone in that dark place, hearing the Martians moving above me. Sometimes I heard them hooting, sometimes the grating sound of their handling machine. On the 3rd day I ventured to look out again. The place was silent. I crept into the scullery, and then into the kitchen. The door into the garden was still closed. I opened it gently and peered out. The Martians had gone. I stepped outside, trembling. The garden was a wreck. The grass was scorched, the trees blackened. The house itself was a ruin, but I was free. I went back into the house and gathered some food. Then I set off, weak and unsteady, through the desolate streets. There was no one. The houses were empty. The roads were strewn with corpses and wreckage. The sky was grey and low, and a foul smell hung in the air. I wandered for hours, not knowing where I was going. I saw dead bodies, ruined houses, and the black dust that marked the passage of the Martians. Once I heard a sound and hid. But it was only a dog, a mangy, starving creature that sniffed at me and then slunk away. So ended the days of my imprisonment. The world I returned to was silent and terrible, but I was alive. Chapter 19. The Death of the Curate. It was on the 6th day of our imprisonment that I peeped for the last time, and presently found myself looking directly into the muzzle of a Martian heat ray. I was on the point of slipping away when the curate clutched me suddenly by the arm and dragged me back. His face was livid, his eyes glaring. He began to talk in a loud voice. I begged him not to. He had eaten little or nothing since the morning of the catastrophe and gone little longer without sleep. His mind was beginning to fail. He was no longer the same man who had shared my flight from Leatherhead. I gripped his arm, shook him, implored him to be silent. He would not listen. He seemed not to hear me. Then I smote him across the face. He went out of my reach and stood swaying, and as I made to step toward him, he turned suddenly back upon me with a frightful scream. He stepped straight into the darkness beside us, and I felt the sudden vibration and heard the sound of movement. I crouched down and remained motionless. He made a gabbling noise and suddenly began to scream and to run blindly in the direction of the pit. I heard the gathering whistle of the heat ray, and in another moment there was a concussion and I was thrown violently backward. My head struck the wall behind me, and I fell into a sort of dream. I remember nothing distinct for a time. My mind was a blank for a period of time. When I came to myself, I was alone. It was night. I rose to my feet. I had a violent headache, and I was stiff all over. I crept into the scullery. The curate had vanished. I suspected that he had been slain, and perhaps dragged away, and that the Martians had left. I decided to explore. Outside the kitchen window I could see nothing. I lit a match and examined the place carefully. There were no traces of blood or struggle. I went back to my hole and sat there in the darkness, chewing bits of biscuit and keeping myself from going mad. The Martians had taken no more notice of me. I was only a rat in a hole. They were busy again in the pit. I could hear them, a choking, humming sound, and every now and then a dull thud. I had seen the upper portion of a Martian body rise slowly and then vanish. I knew they were still at work. The days passed and I became increasingly weak. I grew thin and dry. I began to suffer from the dearth of water. The biscuit I kept, crumb by crumb, as long as I could, but at last I had to venture out in search of water. I remembered an old water butt in the garden. I crept out cautiously and drew water from it in a little can I had found. The smell was foul, but it was water, and I was grateful. That night I slept in the scullery. When I woke, the noise in the pit had ceased. I ventured out again and found the yard silent and empty. I looked up and saw the blackened trees, the shattered wall, and the pit. There was no sign of life. The Martians had gone. I climbed cautiously over the debris and looked into the pit. It was a huge charred hollow. Machinery and heaps of rubbish were scattered everywhere. The place was deserted. I began to weep. I felt as if I had been suddenly set free from a horrible nightmare. Then I returned to the house, gathered a few of the remaining biscuits, and prepared myself for the journey home. But my journey was to take many strange turns, and the Martians were not yet done with the world. Chapter 20. The Death of the Martians. And now comes the strangest thing in my story, yet perhaps it is also the most natural in a scientific age. It is this, that all these things so great and powerful, so pitiless and swift, were slain by the humblest things that God, in his wisdom, has put upon this earth. Before the cylinder fell, there was a general persuasion that through all the deep of space no life existed beyond the petty surface of our minute sphere. It seemed incredible. But I have learned since that not even on this earth has life been so easy and untroubled as our philosophy was accustomed to suppose it. The Martians, deadly as they were in their weapons and striding tripods, had yet another weakness. After all their devices, after all their planning, they were undone not by the guns of man, but by the bacteria of Earth, those minute, unseen creatures against which their systems were unprepared. Slain, after all man's devices had failed, by the humblest things that God, in his wisdom, has put upon this earth. For so it had come about, as indeed I and many others learned in time, that these organisms of disease had taken hold of them. The Martians were not immune. They had no resistance to earthly infection. They must have brought with them all their equipment to destroy life, but they had forgotten the smallest of Earth's dangers. It was not a blow from a human hand, nor a missile from any gun, that brought their end. I remember how I stood upon Primrose Hill and looked down upon the field of death. There, scattered over the ruins of London, lay the great machines, some overthrown, some standing stiffly upright, but each silent and motionless, their occupants dead and already decaying. It was a bright and sunny day. A gentle breeze stirred the trees and blew the brown leaves of October in eddies. The sky was a soft blue, the sun shone warmly. It seemed so strange that on such a day, after such black terror and despair, the world should lie so peaceful once more. I went down the hill, and the city was silent. The houses stood, for the most part, untouched. Here and there a wall had crumbled, a roof had fallen in, but there was no sound of man or Martian, only the wind and the cawing of birds that had begun to return. In the streets I saw corpses, many black with death, lying where they had fallen in flight or fear. Here and there I saw a dog or a cat, once more wandering freely. In places the grass was already growing up through the stones. Nature was reclaiming her own. And then I saw one of the Martian fighting machines standing still and intact in a street near Regent's Park. I approached it with caution, expecting it might yet stir. But it was silent. I climbed up to the hood of the thing and peered inside. There, in the darkness, lay the Martian, slumped and lifeless, a brown, shriveled bulk, half sunken and decaying. Later, I learned from others that the same was true everywhere. From the Thames Valley to the coast, the Martians had died. The black smoke had ceased. The heat rays were still. The tripods were deserted, and the cylinders that had fallen after the first were found to contain nothing but the dead. A few survived long enough to be seen struggling from their machines, feeble, gasping, staggering as they breathed Earth's air and were poisoned by it. They died as men have died upon the Martian plains, slain by germs against which their bodies could not fight. And so, after all man's devices had failed, they were slain by the humblest things. From the moment the Martians fell, the tide of human life began to return. Survivors came cautiously back into the towns and cities. The fires were put out, the dead were buried, the ruins were cleared, and slowly, painfully, London began to live again. It was a different world. So many were gone. So many had changed. I myself had changed. I had seen things no man had ever seen. I had known terror, despair, and wonder beyond all words. And though the Martians were dead, their legacy was not. For who could say that they would not return? That the lesson had been learned? That we, in our complacency, would not again be caught unprepared? But as I walked through the streets of London, I saw the sunlight. I heard the voices of children once more, and I knew that life had returned, that the earth belonged again to man. And so ends the story of the Great War between Mars and Earth. Chapter 21. After the War. It is a curious thing that I, the writer of these pages, grown grey with the passage of years, should look back upon those frantic days of war and terror with something almost of longing. There was a sense of purpose then, a burning intensity, as if the veil of habit and complacency had been torn away and life stood bare and dreadful and full of meaning. Now I go to and fro through London, and I find it busy again. The streets are full of people, the shops are open, the trains run, the telegraphs click, men go to and fro in their familiar routines, and it is as though nothing had ever happened. But for me, there is always the memory. At times I suffer from strange dreams. I see again the valley of death, the black smoke, the burning towns. I wake in the night, thinking I hear the cry of a Martian or the whoop of the heat ray. I walk the quiet streets by day and wonder where the tripods stood, where the black dust lies buried beneath the paving stones. And yet I am grateful, grateful to be alive, to see the sun, to hear the voices of my fellow men, to watch the seasons return. There was a time when I had believed all this gone forever. There are still many mysteries. What were the Martians? What had driven them to Earth? Were they but the vanguard of an invasion that may come again? Or have we seen the last of them? No man can say. But this I do know, that we must not be unready again, that we must learn the lesson of the war, that the complacency of our age, the belief in progress as an end in itself, must give way to a new humility. For man is not alone, and neither are we the rulers of the earth by right, but by fortune. It may be that the future holds marvels greater than we have dreamed. It may be that we are only at the beginning of things. But it may also be that we are watched still, as we once watched the Martians. And while I stand upon this planet, looking up into the stars, I cannot choose but wonder. Chapter 22. The Epilogue. From the War of the Worlds. The torment was over. Even that day the healing began. The survivors of the people scattered over the country, leaderless, lawless, foodless, like sheep without a shepherd, the thousands who had fled by sea, and the 100,000 who had fled by land, from the eastern and southern coasts, from London and the Thames Valley, westward, northward, and over the Welsh mountains, scattered, hungering, despairing, came back. The hand of the destroyer had been stayed. The Martians were dead. And for the moment it seemed almost as if the god of this earth had swung his sword in defence of his children. It was no much that men returned as that humanity returned. Men and women set to work in the ruins of their homes, the wreckage of their industries. Hope began to replace despair. There were few who still feared the Martians might return. There was more fear of the lawlessness and famine that might follow. But slowly and steadily, order returned. The man with the hoe returned to the field, the fireman to his hose, the workman to his bench. People found their homes again or made new ones. They discovered others who had also survived. The churches opened their doors. Slowly, London awoke from its nightmare. But to me also came a sense of wonder. The shadow had been lifted, but the earth had been touched. It was no longer the same world. The fear had left its mark on all things, even on the sunlight. The old world that I had known was gone. I made my way back to the house at Woking, only to find it in ruins. I wandered through familiar places, now strange and empty. Trees I had known were scorched or broken. The roads were silent. My heart was heavy with grief and awe. And then, miraculously, I found her. She whom I had believed lost, my wife, was alive. She had fled with relatives and been spared. We met again in Leatherhead, in the garden of the house where I had left her on the morning of the first cylinder. There, in the sweet air, with birds singing in the branches above, we stood speechless, our hearts full. After all the horror, all the days of despair, we were together again. And still I cannot forget. I see the ruins of great cities. I remember the black smoke, the red weed, the ruthless extermination. I remember how I crouched in terror, thinking myself the last man on earth. And I look up at the sky and wonder, what next? Perhaps the future belongs to us. Perhaps our triumph over the Martians was not chance, but the beginning of something greater. But I do not forget. I have seen the Martians dead. I have seen their machines silent. I have seen London empty. And now, when I see the familiar streets, the comforting glow of lamps at twilight, the sound of a distant train, or the laughter of children, I am thankful. Yet, ever and again, I return to that time. I go to the window and look up at the stars and think of it all again, of the vast, cool and unsympathetic intelligences that regarded this earth with envious eyes and slowly and surely drew their plans against us. And I remember that we are not alone. Thanks for joining us on this journey through the stars. If you enjoyed this audiobook, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new adventure. Explore more science fiction stories right here on Nebula Narratives.